Hello, my dear friends. Queen Elizabeth I was praised as the Virgin, the Great, the glory of England. But there was one thing that few people dared to mention. She could change the smell of a room just minutes after appearing. Between the layers of puffy skirts, lipstick, wigs, and fragrant gloves, there was a constant battle to maintain a noble appearance, while her body was absolutely far from soap. Tonight, we will turn that splendid court upside down to see what the smell of power really is. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. If you ever find yourself dreaming of living in a palace, maybe with golden walls and velvet curtains, I'd like you to pause for a moment, just a quiet moment, and imagine this instead, a room that glows in candlelight. Yes, but also one where the air feels thick, a little too warm, a little too crowded. You take a breath and catch something you weren't quite prepared for. Not the sweet scent of roses or lavender. No, it's the smell of bodies, of wool that's seen too many wearers, of meat-fat candles, and something else that lingers like an awkward guest that refuses to leave. Welcome to Whitehall Palace, the heart of Elizabethan glamour, and possibly one of the worst-smelling royal residences in Europe. From the outside, Whitehall was every bit the dream. Grand stone buildings, endless corridors, towering windows, flags fluttered, musicians played, and ladies glided through in gowns worth more than a farmer's house. It had everything a Renaissance drama needed. Except maybe air circulation. See, once you stepped inside, that grand illusion fell apart, quietly, slowly, with each breath. The walls might have been gilded, the floors polished, but the air was not on your side. There was a reason people stuffed herbs into their sleeves and hung oranges filled with cloves from their belts. They weren't just being festive, they were defending their nostrils. Now, Elizabeth herself was no stranger to this battle. She did everything she could to smell like something other than a person. Her chambers were packed with pomanders and perfumed gloves. Her gowns were lined with dried flowers and spices. When she passed through the court, she didn't walk alone. She floated in a cloud of fragrance so intense, it probably lingered longer than most of her courtiers' careers. And honestly, she needed it. Because the palace didn't just smell of humans, it smelled busy. Think sweat soaked into velvet. Think heavy fur that hasn't seen water in a decade. Think candle smoke from animal fat drifting up into the tapestries and staying there for months. Then think of all of that at once. But let's not blame her, or them. This was normal. In the 16th century, people didn't bathe every day. They weren't bathing every week. If someone bathed once a month, they were showing off. Water wasn't trusted. People thought it opened your pores and let disease in. So instead of washing, they covered, they perfumed, they powdered. The logic was simple if it smells nice. It must be clean. Right. Well, not quite. Imagine wearing 5 layers of clothing, all day, in a crowded hall, while dancing and sweating and eating heavily spiced meat. Then imagine taking that same gown, hanging it up in your wardrobe, and wearing it again tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. You don't wash it, you brush it, you air it out by the window. Maybe you stuff a little lavender in the sleeves, but soap water, no, thank you. That's for peasants or corpses. So when someone walked past you in Whitehall, you didn't just smell them. You smelled their week, their meals, their mood, maybe even their stress. Clothes carried stories, but not the kind you'd want to read up close. The same went for the candles. They were cheap, made from tallow, and burned day and night. The wax melted down the sides in greasy globs. The smell was part barnyard, part kitchen, and part something else, something vaguely alive. It wrapped itself around you and whispered, "This is royal life." Even Elizabeth's rooms, though packed with perfume, you weren't immune. The velvet absorbed everything. The feather mattresses breathed in the air and gave it back slowly. Her presence might have masked the worst of it, but anyone who stepped behind the curtain knew. The court was dazzling from a distance, but up close it was a very different performance, and yet nobody complained, or if they did it carefully. You didn't rise to power by saying the Queen's court smelled like a meat market on a hot day. Ambassadors might write it in their letters home, but in person they bowed, they smiled, and they breathed through their sleeves. The thing is, smell was politics. Scent told you who had power, who had access, who could afford roses shipped from abroad, and who had to settle for stale rosemary. Smelling good wasn't just about personal preference, it was about proving you belonged. Elizabeth knew this better than anyone. Her smell wasn't accidental, it was curated, controlled. Her scent walked into the room before she did. But even the finest perfume has limits. And under all those layers of silk and saffron and civet, the truth still waited, that this palace, for all its beauty, stank. The gowns were brushed but never cleaned. The bodies were perfumed but rarely washed. That the people smiled through their teeth, even as they wondered what that smell was. Today, when we think of royalty, we imagine elegance, clean lines, crisp linens, white gloves. But back then, royal life meant sweat under pearls. It meant grease on velvet. It meant spritzing cinnamon oil over a stain and pretending it wasn't there. And everyone played along, because no one wanted to be the one who admitted the emperor, or in this case, the Queen, might have smelled a little ripe. So yes, Whitehall was a palace, a real one, with grandeur and power and history. But it was also a place where hundreds of people lived in close quarters, in heavy fabrics, without plumbing, without ventilation, and without much soap. The truth didn't hide in the shadows. It hung in the air. You just had to breathe deep enough to notice. And now, as you rest your head, maybe tuck yourself under something soft and freshly laundered. Take a moment to be grateful. Grateful for hot water, for clean sheets, for laundry detergent. And maybe, just maybe, for not being a 16th century noble trying to dance through a summer banquet in a gown that hadn't seen water since Easter. Because, as glorious as the past might seem, it didn't always smell like roses. In Elizabeth's world, there was no such thing as a natural fragrance. If anyone thought they caught a hint of rose or citrus trailing behind her, let's be clear, it wasn't coming from her skin. It was coming from layers of musk and civet oil, dabbed and dusted with the precision of a battlefield tactic. The Queen didn't trust water, she trusted perfume, and she wore it not for charm, but for survival. She didn't just wear perfume, she armed herself with it. Before stepping out into the world, her maids would help her prepare. The process was slow, deliberate. First came the base thick oils rubbed into the wrists and behind the ears. Then the sachets were sewn into her sleeves, little bundles of clove, cinnamon, lavender, and rosemary. Finally, the finishing cloud of crushed resins, ambergris, or whatever expensive substance could stand between her body and the noses of her courtiers. This wasn't beauty, this was damage control. Because when you don't bathe, and you wear 5 layers of unwashed fabric every day, your body starts telling stories you'd rather keep quiet. And Elizabeth had no intention of letting the truth leak out from under her velvet gowns. She was a queen, a symbol, a myth in progress. And nothing kills a myth faster than a whiff of underarm. The court understood this too. Everyone reeked. Of course. But how you reeked, that mattered. It was one thing to smell like sweat and old wool. That meant you were poor, or worse, forgettable. But if your stench came layered in expensive oils and imported powders, Then suddenly it was considered courtly, noble, even. Elizabeth just took it to the next level. She didn't simply cover her odour, she weaponized scent. There are stories of her scent lingering in a room long after she had gone. One ambassador described her presence as heavy in the air. Another mentioned how the room she occupied had to be aired out for hours afterward. No one dared say this to her face. Of course. Not unless they wanted to find themselves reassigned to Ireland. But people noticed. They just chose to describe it in the polite language of the court. She was fragrantly sovereign, which is a delicate way of saying she smelled like she was losing a wrestling match with a spice market. But we have to give her credit. She made it work. In a palace where everyone stank, she managed to make her particular stench feel royal. She understood that perfume wasn't just about hiding the body. It was about projecting power. You could smell a peasant and wrinkle your nose. You could smell the queen and feel humbled. It wasn't fair, but it was effective. Her perfumes weren't cheap either. Musk had to be scraped from deer glands. Civet came from the rear of a wild cat. Ambergris was vomited up by whales and then left to ferment in the ocean. All of these ingredients were rare, foul, and absurdly expensive, which made them perfect for a monarch. She wasn't trying to smell clean. She was trying to smell rich, and in that, she succeeded. Still, even the strongest scent can only do so much. There were warm summer days when the layers of perfume and powder started to melt, revealing hints of the body underneath. Her wigs, which were powdered and perfumed just like everything else, began to trap more than just fragrance. Her gowns, never washed, were soaked in the residue of stress, illness, and the occasional overly long council meeting. The perfume didn't erase this, it just mixed with it. The result was something unique, something that couldn't be bottled. It was part myth, part meat, and part Middle Ages. The Queen smelled like herself, and the closer you got, the more you understood what that meant. But no one said a word. They bowed. They smiled. They kissed her glove and spoke about the weather. They never mentioned the way her presence seemed to settle on their skin long after the meeting had ended. That would have been rude, and no one wanted to be the one who broke the illusion. Meanwhile, the courtiers followed her lead. If the Queen smelled like musk and citrus and whale spit, then by God, so would they. Men dabbed oil behind their ears. Women tucked herbs into their corsets. There was so much perfume in the air that some visitors reported headaches, nausea, and even fainting spells. Still, they smiled through it. Because in the 16th century, passing out from perfume was a sign you'd been in the presence of greatness. And truly, nothing about this was accidental. Elizabeth understood better than anyone that scent was not just personal. It was political. A clean smell meant control. A rich smell meant power. A strong smell meant presence. If you could smell someone before you saw them, then you were already in their orbit. She made sure her scent entered a room first. Her body came later. It's hard not to admire that kind of precision. Even if the method was, by modern standards, disgusting. Because let's not forget what perfume was covering. No baths, no deodorant, no dental hygiene to speak of. Just cloth, powder, sweat, and desperation. You could scrape off the top layer of one of her gloves and probably discover half a year's worth of court history in the residue. And maybe that's what made her scent so unforgettable. It wasn't just perfume, it was a biography. It told the story of a woman who had no choice but to become a legend. One pomander at a time. But legend or not, the truth always seeps through eventually. And if you want to understand the full picture, you'll need to look past the perfume, past the sleeves stuffed with rosemary, past the powdered wigs, and into the closet. Because the real story, the one that couldn't be masked, was hanging right there in plain sight. In the quiet corners of the palace, where the light was softer and the sounds were muffled by heavy curtains, gowns hung in stillness. Some had embroidery so fine it looked like it was stitched with hair. Others carried threads of gold that caught the candlelight just right. But if you stepped closer, not to admire with your eyes, but to breathe in gently, the truth would come through. These dresses didn't smell like lavender. Not really. They smelled like something trying to be lavender, like something that had seen too many bodies and too few buckets of water. At court, clothing was not cleaned, it was preserved, maintained, perhaps, pampered, even, but never scrubbed, never soaked. The idea of putting fine velvet into water was unthinkable. It would shrink, stretch, bleed, die, and lose its shape. These weren't clothes meant to be washed. They were clothes meant to be brushed. So every morning, while the Queen sat at her table or stood before her mirror, someone was nearby with a stiff-bristled brush, working down the folds of yesterday's gown. They turned it inside out, beat it softly, brushed the seams, and shook it near the window. Sometimes they would hang it on a stand near the fire to let the heat pull out the damp. But water? No. Water was for the peasants and the rain. Instead, the clothing was scented. They tucked sachets of dried herbs into the linings, usually rosemary, lavender or thyme, sometimes bits of orange peel or cinnamon bark. They sewed the sachets into sleeves and bodices and hemmed them into the folds of petticoats. The smell wasn't strong enough to fool anyone up close, but it created a kind of illusion. From a few steps away, you might think the Queen smelled sweet. You'd have to get much closer to realise the sweetness was only skin deep. She changed her underclothes more often. Linen shifts, stockings, and things that touched the skin directly. Those were washed when they could be. Not with soap, exactly, but with a kind of rinsing and wringing that passed for cleanliness. Still, by the end of the day, they carried the truth of the body they covered, and by the end of the week, the layers on top had absorbed more than enough. Gloves were a category of their own. They were soft leather, sometimes lined with silk, often stitched with delicate patterns, but more importantly they were soaked in scent, rose oil, violet, bergamot, and sometimes stronger things, like camphor or clove. The Queen wore them almost constantly. She gestured with them, held court with them, let nobles kiss them as a form of greeting. It was part tradition, part theatre, part hygiene. After all, it was better to kiss a perfumed glove than a hand that hadn't seen soap in weeks. These gloves were rarely cleaned. If they got too worn, they were replaced. If they got stiff, they were rubbed with scented pomade to soften the leather. Some were so richly perfumed that their scent outlived their stitching. But even then, the gloves carried more than fragrance. They carried the residue of meals, of handshakes, of long days spent gripping the arm of a throne. The dresses, meanwhile, carried history in their folds. One could argue they were more honest than the portraits. A painting might show a queen in perfect stillness, untouched by age or sweat. But her dress, hanging in a dark wardrobe, would tell another story. It would whisper of the nervous heat of negotiations, of fevers hidden behind a powdered smile, of hours spent standing while the body underneath begged for rest. And that fabric, for all its beauty, was rarely alone. Lace, brocade, velvet, and fur, all of them absorbed scent. Not just perfume, but body scent, skin oil, the slight sourness of stress, the warmth of summer, the damp of winter. It was all held tight in the weave. And because the gowns were never washed, those smells never really left. They just mingled with whatever perfume was added the next day, one layer on top of another, until the gown no longer smelled like rose or musk. It just smelled like Elizabeth. Servants learned not to comment. They brushed and dusted, turned the fabric, and aired it carefully, all while pretending it was still fresh. They worked in silence, their hands moving over seams that hadn't seen water in months. They knew which gown was heavier with scent, which one had been worn through an illness, which one had been worn during a storm. They knew more than they said, and the Queen, to her credit, didn't pretend the gowns were clean, but she did pretend they were presentable. and in her world, presentation was everything. Cleanliness was not about soap. It was about the illusion of control. A well-brushed gown meant stability. A perfumed hem meant power. A gloved hand meant distance. She wore these things like a shield, and the people around her played along. The court, as a whole, followed the pattern. Nobles aired their clothes near windows. They beat them with paddles, sprinkled them with powders, and rubbed them with cloths soaked in vinegar and herbs. But they didn't wash them. That was too risky. Better to smell like rosemary and old wool than to ruin a doublet that cost more than a year's rent. So the smell of the palace became something complex. It wasn't foul, not in the obvious way, but it wasn't clean either. It was old fabric, new perfume, stale sweat, and burnt tallow. It was an effort layered over avoidance, and it stuck to you, on your skin, your hair, your tongue. You left the palace and carried a piece of it with you. The queen's gowns, her gloves, her collars, even her shoes, none of it saw water. Only brushes, only powders, only layers of distraction. And in a way, that's what Elizabeth's court was. A place where everything was covered and very little was cleaned. A place where people walked in beauty and left in silence. Too polite to mention the smell. But if you stood close to her, close enough to see the fine stitching on her sleeves, close enough to catch the warmth rising from the fabric, you'd know, you'd feel it, you'd smell it, and you'd understand that royalty doesn't always mean cleanliness. Sometimes it just means no one is allowed to mention the dirt, and still, the worst of it wasn't the clothes, it was what lay beneath them, the skin, the sores, the sweat that soaked through the linen and refused to be ignored, because for all the perfume and the brushing and the lavender sachets, there was one thing Elizabeth could never escape, her own body. In Elizabeth's court, people didn't bathe, not really. The idea of stepping into a tub, soaking your body, letting water touch your skin from head to toe, wasn't just rare, it was considered dangerous. And for the people who lived in lace collars and heavy brocade, that danger was taken seriously. You could ruin your health, they said. Open your pores to bad air. Let illness creep in through the skin. So instead of washing, they perfumed. Instead of cleaning, they masked. Cleanliness, for them, was something you performed, not something you did. The Queen herself was no exception. She didn't bathe often, maybe once a month, maybe less. When she did, it was a quiet event, surrounded by women she trusted. The room would be warmed ahead of time, curtains drawn, herbal water prepared, but even then, it was more ritual than cleansing. The cloth was never scrubbed, the water never cooled, the air always smelled of rose and steam and candle smoke. It wasn't about removing dirt. It was about restoring the illusion of freshness. For daily routines, there were other methods. Bowls of scented water were set on low tables. A cloth would be dipped, wrung, and passed gently across the face or hands, sometimes over the chest, never the legs, never the feet. That was too intimate, too risky. Perfumed vinegar was dabbed onto linen squares, then brushed along the neck, the temples, the wrists. It left behind a sharpness. Not quite clean, but not entirely unpleasant either. The goal wasn't to be clean. The goal was to smell like someone who didn't need to be. Tubs did exist, made of wood or lined with tin, but they weren't used in any regular way. Most sat in storage, waiting for a special occasion or a particularly bad fever, when someone truly stank, or when illness made it necessary. Servants might prepare a bath, but even then, it wasn't something to celebrate. People stepped into tubs the way one steps into a doctor's office, with caution, with doubt, with the hope that they'd come out no worse than they went in. Herbal bags were a common substitute. Cloth pouches filled with dried flowers, mint, rosemary, and sometimes burnt orange peel. These were soaked in warm water and pressed against the body. The water turned cloudy, the scent was sharp, the feeling was comforting, but the skin remained, still oily, still dusty, still carrying whatever had settled there yesterday. And the day before, this system, strange as it sounds now, made sense to them. The people around Elizabeth didn't believe dirt was the problem. They believed smell was, if you didn't stink, you weren't dirty. If you smelled floral, you were clean. Even if the only thing touching your body was rose water poured over the same linen rag 3 times a week. It's tempting to laugh at it, to imagine nobles waving around their scented sachets while their skin cracked beneath layers of powder. But this wasn't laziness, it was logic, shaped by fear. The fear of plague, of unseen illnesses, of air that could turn deadly if it touched damp skin. And so, rather than take the risk, they powdered, they perfumed, they stayed dry. Elizabeth had her methods. A favourite was to hold a pomander near her face, inhaling gently when someone approached. It looked like elegance. It was defence. She knew what her courtiers smelled like, and she had no intention of letting that stench take root in her lungs. Behind her fans, her gloves, her silks there was always a barrier. Scent wasn't just fragrance, it was armour. In summer, things got worse. Heat pressed down on the palace. Layers of clothing stuck to the skin. Linen clung. Hair matted. Wigs turned sour. The air grew heavy with a mix of sweat and perfume and tallow smoke. And yet, no one reached for soap. No one drew a bath. Instead, they reached for more powder, more spice, more distraction. Sometimes, one could smell the queen before seeing her. A dense bloom of rose, musk, and something deeper. It floated through the halls, around corners, into rooms. It told you she was coming, and it told you too that she was trying to rise above the stink of her court, trying to stay sovereign in a world that refused to stay clean. The servants noticed. They always do. They washed the clothes, refreshed the bowls, scented the gloves, but they never said a word, because the system worked. No one talked about the dirt. So long as it smelled expensive, it wasn't real. And Elizabeth, for all her power, lived within that rule. Her body was sacred, untouched, above discomfort, but it was also human. It sweated, it ached, it cracked beneath the corset. And though she held herself like a statue, the body underneath kept telling the truth. Still, no one said a thing. But when the candlelight hit her gown just right, when the scent curled toward your face instead of away from it, the illusion faltered, just a little, just enough for you to wonder, and just enough to know. Because underneath all the perfume and powder and ceremony, something else lingered, something no bag of herbs could fully erase. And if you want to see just how far they went to hide it, you'll need to watch what she did to her face. There was a time when people looked at Elizabeth's face and saw perfection, pale as moonlight, smooth as porcelain, untouchable in every sense. From a distance, it didn't look like skin, it looked like a mask. But that was the point. She wasn't trying to appear human, she was trying to look eternal, untouched by illness, unshaken by time. And to do that, she needed more than just powder. She needed ritual, and a great deal of poison. Every morning, while the palace was still waking up and the halls were filling with smoke from the kitchen fires, Elizabeth sat in silence and began the process. Her maids knew the order. The clothes were laid out, the pigments arranged, the oils uncorked. The base came first, a thick layer of ceruse, made from white lead mixed with vinegar. It went on with a soft cloth, sometimes with a sponge. The texture was heavy, smooth, but with weight, like painting plaster onto warm skin. The lead made the skin look bright, whiter than any natural colour. In those days, pale skin was a sign of nobility. It meant you stayed indoors, that you didn't labour in the sun like common folk. So Elizabeth covered every inch of her face and neck, sometimes even her hands. The cerus created a blank surface, flawless, or so it seemed. Then came the shimmer, crushed pearls, ground fine, were dusted lightly across the cheeks and forehead. They gave her a glow that flickered in candlelight. Not a healthy glow, not something that came from within, but something reflected, manufactured. The kind of beauty that looked best from across the room, not up close. For colour, she used vermilion, a deep red pigment made from mercury sulfide. It was mixed with a bit of oil and tapped onto the cheeks, just enough to suggest warmth, a pulse, a hint of youth that no longer came naturally. On some days, her lips were tinted too, not always, but when she needed to appear strong, the red helped. None of it was safe, not the lead, not the mercury. Over time, they burned the skin, caused rashes, ate into the soft tissue, but there was no turning back. The more the makeup damaged her skin, the more she needed it. It became a cycle. Cover the damage, 'cause more damage, cover again. Servants began to notice. They said nothing, of course, but they saw the red patches, the rawness around her nose, the way her face had to be rebuilt each morning with thicker layers. A diplomat once wrote that her appearance seemed to melt by evening. Another noted how different she looked when she turned her head. The illusion only held from the front, and yet she continued. Because she had to. The Queen couldn't appear weak, not in public, not even in private. Her body might ache, her teeth might rot, but her face had to stay steady, pale, bright, fixed. It was her shield, her symbol, and perhaps, in the quietest parts of her mind, her prison too. She rarely touched her face, not in public, not even to adjust a curl. That was left to the maids, who wiped and brushed and powdered in silence. They learned to keep a steady hand, a soft voice. They saw the lines that deepened each year, and the thinness beneath the jaw, but they said nothing. Their job wasn't to reveal the Queen, it was to maintain her. By the time she stepped into the public eye, the transformation was complete. Her skin looked flawless, her cheeks flushed, her eyes were bright, but beneath it all was something tender, something raw, and every evening as the paint was wiped away, the truth returned, bit by bit, crack by crack. Elizabeth's skin grew more sensitive as she aged. Some days, the makeup stung. Other days, it refused to stay in place. Her hands, once steady, began to tremble. Her eyes tired more quickly, but she never stopped, even when her ladies had to do most of the work, even when the pigment flaked, even when her reflection turned unfamiliar. And the strange part is, no one questioned it. Not the courtiers. Not the ambassadors. Not even the poets who wrote verses about her glowing face. They knew it wasn't natural. They just didn't care. Because the illusion was more important than the woman beneath it. Elizabeth wasn't just a person. She was a painting in motion, a statue that spoke, and as long as the powder was thick enough, no one had to think too hard about what was underneath. Sometimes, when the light hit her just right, the makeup shimmered like a mask of glass. People would stop and stare, not because she looked beautiful, but because she looked permanent, unchanging, as if time had forgotten her. But time never forgets, and neither does skin. The longer she wore the lead, the more it wore her down, and the more she faded beneath it. What began as a disguise became her face, and what began as a way to appear alive became a way to hide how tired she was. Still, she smiled. Still, she stood. Still, she turned her cheek to be kissed through gloves and lace. Because the Queen could not falter, not in the face, not in the posture, and certainly not in the scent. But there were days, quiet days, when the paint cracked a little sooner, when the smile didn't quite reach her eyes, when the powder clung too heavily to skin that had grown thin. And those were the moments when her ladies moved a little faster, brushed a little softer, and held their breath. Because if the mask slipped too far, there would be nothing behind it but flesh and fatigue. and all the perfume in the world couldn't keep that from showing. Her face could be painted, her scent could be sculpted, her gowns could be brushed until they shimmered like frost in candlelight. But there was one thing Elizabeth could never quite hide. Her mouth, the teeth behind the smile, the breath that floated out between words, that, no matter how many herbs she chewed or gloves she wore, had a way of slipping past the mask she built. She loved sweet things. It wasn't a secret. Sugar had become a symbol of wealth in her time, something imported, refined, and prized. She had access to it in ways her subjects could only dream of. Candied violets, marzipan, sweetmeats packed in decorative boxes, sugared almonds by the handful. These were delicacies she enjoyed not just during feasts, but often enough for her teeth to notice, and they did. By the middle of her reign, her teeth had begun to rot. Slowly at first, a darkening here, a tenderness there. Then came the aching, the swelling. The silent hours where she pressed a cloth to her cheek and willed the pain away. Her doctors tried what they could, but dentistry in the 16th century was closer to punishment than medicine. They had powders to rub on the gums, cloves to chew, metal picks to dig at decay, and if all else failed, they had forceps, iron ones, with no anaesthetic, just grip and pull and hope. She resisted treatment as long as she could. The thought of showing that kind of weakness, opening her mouth and letting someone peer inside, made her stomach turn, but the pain wore her down. Eventually, she allowed a few trusted physicians to help, quietly, behind closed doors, far from the eyes and ears of the court. They packed her molars with softened waxes, applied oil-soaked cloths, sometimes even ground opium into a paste, and rubbed it along the gum line. It dulled the pain, but only for a while. Her breath began to change. It grew sour, thick. It carried not just the scent of her meals, but the deeper scent of something festering, the kind of smell that curled at the edges, that made people lean back without realizing it. And yet, no one said a word. Not to her, not directly. The Queen did not smell. The Queen could not smell. So when conversation grew difficult, when heads turned slightly to the side, when fan after fan fluttered in a silent breeze, no one dared admit why. They spoke in euphemisms. She seemed tired. She was not feeling herself. The weather had worn her out, and always. They blamed the room, the heat, the closeness, the season, but never the breath itself. She knew, of course. You always know. The human nose is honest. More honest than words. More honest than mirrors. She noticed when people flinched. She saw the hesitation in their eyes, the slight delay in their approach. And so she adjusted. She spoke less in close quarters. She kept a handkerchief nearby, laced with orange blossom or clove. She offered her hand, gloved and scented, instead of leaning in. Distance became part of the ritual. Her court followed suit. They began to mimic her habits. Fans grew larger, gloves became more perfumed, even speech patterns shifted. Fewer long monologues, more nodding, more gestures, more polite silences. It became easier to flatter from a distance. Safer, too. No one wrote openly about it in their letters, but the hints were there. A visiting noble once mentioned the air around her being thick with dignity. Another described the Queen's presence as rich and enveloping. Delicate phrases, carefully chosen, meant to say what couldn't be said. Behind the lace and velvet, behind the legend, there was a woman who had stopped smiling quite as wide. Still, she kept the illusion alive. The portraits showed her with tight lips, perfectly closed, untroubled. The poets praised her smile as radiant, her breath as sweet. But behind closed doors, the doctors grew more concerned. The extractions were becoming more frequent. Some teeth fell out on their own. Others had to be removed. Over time, Chewing became difficult. She began to avoid certain foods. She ate slowly, picking at soft dishes, soups, stewed fruits. Even her favourites began to lose their appeal. There were rumours, of course, whispers that she sometimes refused to eat in public. She left banquets early, that she spent hours alone after meals, rinsing with rose water, resting. But these stories never made it into the official histories. The Queen was strong. The Queen was eternal. She couldn't be brought low by something as small as a tooth. And so the silence continued. In the privacy of her chamber, she endured it. The smell, the pain, the bleeding, the dread of the next meal, and the court kept its distance, careful not to mention what they all sensed. Because if the Queen's mouth betrayed her, the illusion cracked. And no one wanted to live in a world where the Virgin Queen had to excuse herself for bad breath. There's something deeply human in that, in the way people protected the image, even as the reality slipped further away. They weren't lying, not exactly. They were preserving something larger than one woman, a myth that had carried them through wars and doubts and years of plague. And if that meant ignoring the smell, then so be it. But history has a nose of its own, and over time, the truth begins to show. In the letters, in the treatments recorded, in the subtle changes to her routine, in the way she kept her lips pressed together, even when laughing, even when hurting, because behind the powdered face and perfumed gloves, there was a mouth that suffered in silence, and behind that silence, a queen who ruled through pain no one dared name. Somewhere in the quiet heart of the palace, behind the carved doors and velvet curtains, stood a chair. It didn't look like much at first glance. Plain, wooden, with a cushion that had seen better years. But lift the lid, and the truth sat waiting. This was no throne. This was the Queen's private seat, her close stool, her toilet, though no one dared call it that out loud. It was made to look modest, respectable, even. A sturdy piece of furniture, tucked in a corner like a reading bench. But beneath the cushion was a round hole, and beneath that, a chamber pot. Brass, most likely. Or pewter, if someone had polished it that week. It was designed for dignity, for discretion. Because even a queen, painted and perfumed and draped in lace, still had to relieve herself. She didn't go alone, of course. There were attendants, trained in silence, who helped manage the process. They brought the basin, the cloths, and the fresh herbs. They poured scented vinegar into small bowls. They folded towels with practiced hands and kept their eyes lowered. They didn't speak unless spoken to, because this wasn't just a bodily function. This was a ceremony. There was no plumbing in Whitehall, nothing that flushed, drained, or disappeared with a lever. Everything stayed where it landed until someone came to carry it away. That someone was not the Queen, nor her ladies. It was a servant, lower in rank, higher in discretion, tasked with the removal of waste from the royal body. Their job was simple and constant. The room wasn't sealed, but it was closed. Heavy drapes were drawn. Windows, if they opened at all, were narrow and high. Air didn't move so much as settle, which meant the smell did too. A quiet presence, never acknowledged, always present. A scent that clung to the walls and whispered reminders that beneath the silk and ceremony, there was always flesh. They tried to manage it. Scented sachets were hung from hooks. Bowls of dried lavender sat near the door. Orange peels soaked in vinegar were left on wide dishes to slowly sour the air in a more acceptable direction. Sometimes, someone would walk through with a censer, swinging it gently, letting thin trails of smoke drift through the stillness. But it never lasted long. The room always reclaimed its truth. Elizabeth used rose water to rinse her hands, sometimes with a cloth, sometimes poured from a small jug into a silver basin. The same basin, perhaps, used by dozens of hands before hers. No one truly washed. They dabbed, they freshened, They pressed scented cloths to the skin and called it clean. It's easy to imagine a palace without filth, to picture polished floors and glimmering chandeliers, everything in order, everything under control. But underneath the surface, the truth always waited. The Queen's close stool was not unique. Every noble had one, every hallway had its faint trail, and the servants knew where to walk and where not to breathe too deeply. The waste was carried away daily, sometimes more, sometimes less. It depended on the mood of the palace, on the weather, on the cook's success or failure, and every bucket, every pot had to be walked by hand to a pit or cart or river, quietly, carefully, without drawing attention, because no one wanted to be reminded that behind the velvet there was always this. The stool itself was kept clean as it could be, scrubbed with vinegar, wiped with cloth soaked in thyme and sage, covered with fresh linen when needed. But the pot beneath told its own story. It held more than waste. It held the Queen's hours, her silences, her stomach's rebellion after a bad feast, her pain on days when her body betrayed her, and sometimes, perhaps, her relief when no one was watching. It wasn't spoken of, not in court, not in whispers. People referred to her comfort or her retreat. The word toilet hadn't even taken its modern shape. It was a ritual, not a place. And for Elizabeth, it was the only room in the palace where no one expected her to speak. Still, she carried herself with the same grace. Even here, her robes were lifted carefully, her posture remained, her face was calm, because the Queen could not collapse, not even in private. And if she ever winced or faltered, the maids turned their heads. The dignity had to be protected, always, but the smell could not be denied, and some days it crept out beyond the curtains, down the hall, into nearby chambers. No one mentioned it. They opened a window, lit another candle, dabbed more perfume on their cuffs, and carried on. It became a part of the palace itself. The scent of bodies and waste, of vinegar and lavender, of smoke and silence. A smell that settled into the stone and rose with the warmth each morning. It was not foul, not exactly, but it was human, deeply, undeniably human. And no matter how much they perfumed it, it never quite went away. Elizabeth knew this. She wasn't naive. She understood the limits of perfume, of powder, of pretense. But she also understood the necessity of pretending. And so the stool was kept hidden. The scent was managed, and her gaze stayed steady. Because if a queen could smile while standing in sickness, she could certainly sit in silence and make the world believe she did not need at all. And yet, beneath her chair, beneath the floor, and beneath the palace itself, something was brewing. Something larger than one chamber pot. Something that couldn't be wiped away with rose water. Even after stepping away from the close stool, the ceremony didn't end. The Queen would lift her hands and extend them slightly, and someone would bring over the basin, not filled with clean water, but with a solution of rose water or vinegar, lightly warmed, sometimes scented with clove or thyme. She didn't scrub, no lather, no soap, just a careful rinse, dabbing the fingers, smoothing the palms. It wasn't about removing anything, it was about restoring the illusion. This gesture, so soft and perfumed, made its way into the royal routine like a quiet bow. People around her mirrored it, not because they understood germs, no one did, but because touching was a daily ritual. The Queen touched letters, hands, gloved fingers, rings. She was kissed on the hand at every formal event, and each time, someone else's breath came close to her skin. But don't be mistaken, this was not widespread hygiene. Elizabeth's rosewater rinse was more a form of etiquette than a habit of health. Most members of the court saw no reason to clean their hands unless food or filth made it necessary. They wiped their fingers on napkins, sleeves, or the edge of the tablecloth, then reached for a goblet. They dipped their fingers into bowls of dried fruit. They pulled at roasted meat with their bare hands. Then they went right back to dancing. After banquets, servants might bring scented cloths to the noble tables. These were waved lazily across the fingers, like brushing away a bit of ash. The rich did not wash. They freshened. They disguised. A courtier might carry a lemon peel in his pocket, ready to rub between his palms to cut through the stronger smells. Others kept a small bottle of vinegar in their pouch, dabbed on their gloves to appear polite, but gloves were rarely removed, and the hands inside told a different story. It was the same with the ladies, sleeves long enough to wipe, rings thick enough to trap grease beneath them. Silk gloves that hadn't been turned inside out in weeks. The perfumes on their wrists clashed with the odour of untouched skin. Some wore pomanders, little orbs filled with herbs and resin, hanging from their waists or tucked into folds of fabric. A subtle hint of cleanliness, floating beside a much louder truth. During court dances, hands were joined, twirled, and lifted. Sweat passed easily. Heat rose. Gloves rubbed against gloves, and bare fingers brushed against brocade. The perfume mingled with skin, but no one stopped to wash. They were too busy smiling, laughing. They showed off how graceful they could be in heavy gowns and tight shoes. The filth moved between them like a guest no one invited, but no one dared to mention. There were gestures to signal refinement, offering your gloved hand for a kiss, holding a perfumed cloth to your nose while walking past the servants, dipping fingertips into a shallow dish of herbs before a meal. These replaced soap. They stood in for water. And in a palace as grand as Whitehall, they were enough. But what wasn't visible was how quickly things travelled. A touch on the hand, a cough during conversation, a borrowed fan. The nobles passed more than gossip. Illnesses slid from skin to skin. A fever in one corner of the ballroom became a whisper by morning. A sore throat in the chapel echoed through the corridors the next day. And still, the basins stayed empty. Still, the rosewater was for the Queen alone. Elizabeth, to her credit, was more cautious than most. She understood appearances, and in her mind, clean hands made for a clean reign, or at least a fragrant one. She carried herself with a kind of sacred distance. A queen must seem untouchable, and a well-scented palm helped, but even her habits were symbolic. The hands were rinsed. Yes, the face was dabbed, the wrists were perfumed, yet the sleeves stayed heavy. The skin beneath the rings never saw daylight. And when her gloves came off, if they ever did, they told their own story, not filthy, but not fresh either. Somewhere between presentable and persistent. Some whispered that Elizabeth had a special glove made for sleeping, lined with herbs, infused with wax, meant to soothe the skin overnight and mask whatever lingered from the day. Whether this was true or not, no one could say, but it fit the pattern. Cleanliness was performance, a layer, a scent, a glove between truth and touch. By morning, the cycle restarted. The basin was filled. The vinegar stirred. The clothes were folded neatly beside her mirror. She would press her fingertips into the bowl and lift them again, letting the scent rise like incense, a queen's ablution, half ritual, half mask, and wholly accepted. Meanwhile, in the other corners of the court, fingers remained darkened with ink, with soot, with meat juices and powdered sugar. They reached into bowls, tugged at laces, and fixed jewels, and nobody minded. Because the performance had never been about cleanliness. It had always been about what people could pretend to see. If you walked through Whitehall with your eyes half closed, you might believe the place was spotless. If you judged by perfume, you might think you were surrounded by saints. But open your eyes fully, and the truth settles into your nose. Behind every rose petal was a residue. Behind every glove, a film. Behind every hand, the unwashed echo of someone else's day. And just like that, we move from fingertips to fabric, because what touched those hands most often was not soap, but sleeves. Gowns brushed against elbows, cuffs were adjusted, scarves were passed from one perfumed body to the next, and those gowns, those carefully kept, rarely washed, endlessly brushed gowns, they had secrets of their own. They hung there like banners of power, each cloak heavy with embroidery, trimmed with fur, stiffened with ornate collars. From a distance, they looked like they had been stitched by angels, but up close, they smelled like people, not just any people, but the kind who sweat through ceremonies, who sit under heavy wigs, who dance in velvet halls warmed only by candle heat and breath. These were not freshly laundered garments. They were costumes of survival, scented but never soaked. Every morning, the routine began quietly. The maids turned the cloaks inside out, their fingers grazing the lining where skin had rubbed against fabric for weeks. They shook out the dust gently, never too hard, for the seams were old and the threads held grudges. They hung each piece near a cracked window, letting the breeze carry away the worst of it, but not too long, since sunlight could fade the rich dyes and ruin the illusion of opulence. There was no washing, no basin, no soap. These were luxury items, and water was considered an enemy. A single drop could stain, a full rinse could unravel. Instead, there were brushes with stiff bristles, used to sweep away what little dust clung to the outer surface. They didn't clean the garment. They convinced it to look presentable, at least under a low candlelight. Perfume sachets were tucked into every fold, lavender for one dress, orris root for another, sometimes clove or dried rose petals. They were sewn right into the hems, hidden between pleats and shoulder seams. The idea was not to create a pleasant scent, but to disguise the unavoidable. A cloak that had never touched water was never going to smell like linen, but it could smell expensive. Some cloaks had not been worn in months, yet they carried the memory of every previous use. A faint trail of rouge where the queen's cheek had brushed the collar, a darker stain near the cuffs where wine had splashed and dried. The scent of long council days, of heated arguments behind closed doors, of rituals that lasted into the night. No one dared wash any of it away. These were not just garments, they were living archives. The Queen's attendants were trained in the art of maintenance without cleansing. If a cloak bore a mark too visible to ignore, they stitched a flower over it. If a smell became intolerable, they rotated the garment into storage and waited a season before bringing it out again. But they never said the word dirty. It was considered too ordinary, too undignified for the royal wardrobe. Elizabeth had hundreds of gowns, yet she often returned to her favourites, not because they were fresh, but because they performed well. A stiff hem held posture, a layered bodice gave the illusion of strength. A well-brushed velvet looked new from a throne, even if it smelled like last summer's heatwave up close. Even the undergarments, the linen shifts worn closest to the body, were only washed when necessary, and necessary had its definition at court. A spot of vinegar might be dabbed under the arms, a sachet tucked into the bodice. Washing was for servants, for farm women, for people without tapestries in their bedrooms. The air in the wardrobe chamber carried the weight of this approach. It did not smell of cleanliness, nor of decay. It was something in between. Dry herbs, a hint of old sweat, the cloying sweetness of rose oil mixed with the sharpness of camphor. It was the scent of effort, layered day after day, until it became familiar, until it became part of the crown. Once, a foreign envoy whispered that England's court smelled like a church on fire. No one corrected him. It wasn't far from the truth. Resinous, smoky, sanctified, but mostly flammable, and it was flammable. Some attendants worried that the amount of musk, oils, and powders rubbed into the fabrics could set off sparks if they stood too close to the hearth. There were quiet accidents, a sleeve too near a candle, a sash that smouldered after brushing against a lantern, but these were not spoken of. Image came before risk. Always. In this court, being clean was not the same as appearing clean. A spotless cloak was not to be trusted. It meant it had not yet been worn by the Queen, had not absorbed her presence, had not played its part in the great theatre of monarchy. Each garment told a story, not one of freshness, but of continuity, of ritual, of scent as memory, as power, as camouflage. Because no one could smell like lavender and myrrh without a reason. It took planning, it took discipline, it took a careful understanding that even dirt could be shaped into something regal. And above all these cloaks and gowns, above the layers of fabric and fragrance, sat something even more carefully crafted, hair that wasn't hers, curls and coils that came not from the Queen's head but from wig stands and drawers, hair that had its own scent, its own rules, its little secrets. And so, as we rise from the shoulders to the crown, it's time to look at what rested atop the Queen's head. Another layer, another mask, another source of scent, and this one, too, had never been washed. Sitting just above all the unwashed cloaks and perfumed gowns, the Queen's wigs were a kingdom of their own. Dozens of them lined the shelves of her private chamber, each styled into stiff curls, towering coils, or carefully arranged waves. They did not smell like hair. They smelled like cinnamon bark, violet powder, burnt herbs, and old candle smoke, and that was intentional. Elizabeth didn't wear these wigs to fool anyone. Everyone at court knew her real hair was thinning, that the bright copper red had long faded into something more fragile and grey. The wigs weren't for deception, they were for display. Each one was an ornate sculpture, lacquered in wax, sprinkled with perfume powder, and so heavily scented that a breeze could carry their smell down a corridor before the Queen even arrived. But there was a price. These wigs were never cleaned. Not once. They were too fragile for water, too stiff for combs. So whatever touched them stayed. Bits of face powder clung to the roots. Traces of rouge settled near the temples. On hot days, sweat would rise from the Queen's scalp and mix with the oils, creating a scent that was uniquely hers, sweet, spicy, slightly sour, and unmistakably royal. The wig attendants tried their best. They would dust each piece gently with perfumed starch, layer on another veil of crushed lavender or bergamot, maybe dab a little vinegar to tame the sharpness, but there was no fixing the core problem. A scented wig is still a used wig, and in the summer months, with firelit chambers and no ventilation, those scents became assertive. When the Queen leaned down to whisper to a courtier, they would sometimes flinch ever so slightly, not out of fear, but from the thick blend of aromas rising from her hairline. It wasn't offensive exactly, just overwhelming, a mix of heat, herbs, and history condensed into every strand. You didn't so much smell it to survive it. Over time, each wig developed its personality. One might carry the deep spice of cloves and pepper, another the sticky sweetness of dried rose petals. One unfortunate piece picked up a lingering note of mildew after being stored too close to the tapestries during a damp spring. It was given a new name, the Widowmaker, though no one said it aloud when the Queen wore it. Of course, no one would dare suggest washing them. The wigs were considered too sacred, too entwined with royal ritual. To wash them would be to erase the hours of labour, the layers of meaning, so instead they were aired out near windows, brushed with squirrel tail brushes, and left in boxes lined with mint leaves. Whether or not it helped was debatable. This olfactory theatre served a purpose. The Queen's scent, rising from hair, cloak, gloves, and skin, was a signal. It told courtiers when she had entered the room. It told foreign envoys that they were in the presence of something beyond human. It told servants to stay back if they were overly sensitive to musk. The wigs were not just hairpieces, they were crowns in disguise, heavier than they looked, uncomfortable to wear, and impossible to forget. Some were studded with pearls, others topped with feathers or netting. and all of them were stiff with product. One strong breeze could probably lift the whole thing off, if not for the strategic use of pins. There were rumours that the Queen sometimes slept upright to preserve her wigs between events, that she had a special frame to hold her head steady, and that her maids would resent the hair in the early morning hours without waking her. These tales were likely exaggerated, but not entirely unbelievable. After all, image was everything, and the Queen's image had a smell. No one in her court could imitate it exactly, though many tried. Lesser nobles powdered their hair with similar mixtures, hoping to channel a little of her presence, but they didn't have the layers. The years, the practiced weight of wigs worn like armour. What they had were imitations, sweet and thin, lacking the full-bodied intensity of the Queen's original formula. To stand close to her was to feel part of a ceremony. Not just visual, but visceral. You saw the brightness of the wig, the shimmer of powder, the stiff lace edge pressed to her temple, and you smelled the history, the effort, the stubborn refusal to be ordinary. And beneath all those layers of scent and starch, behind the curls that never moved and the wax that never melted, was a very human head, tired, aging, and sweating through the rituals of being divine. But the court didn't want a human. They wanted a monument, so she gave them one. Every morning, one wig at a time, and just like the cloaks, just like the gloves, each wig was only part of the surface. There were still deeper layers, still more rituals to hide the truth. And as we move from crown to fingertip, the story continues, in every scented glove and unwashed hand that reached out for power. By the time a visitor reached the inner halls of Elizabeth's court, they had already entered a world shaped not just by golden velvet, but by scent. The corridors reeked of intention, not chaos, not dirt, but purposefully layered perfumes, pressed into every thread, powdered onto every wig, smeared into every glove. Politics, here, didn't start with words, they started with smell. If a noblewoman wore violet oil, she was signalling refinement. If a courtier's coat reeked of civet or musk, it meant he had money, or at least access to someone who did. The poorer attendants, if allowed near, smelled faintly of old wool and whatever herbs they could afford to stuff in their sleeves, but their presence was tolerated only briefly, because in this world, stink was status, or rather, the absence of it was. The Queen herself was a symphony of curated smells. She didn't just want to look untouchable, she wanted to smell untouchable, and she achieved it. Whether standing at the top of the great staircase or walking slowly through the privy chamber, her scent arrived before her. People turned, not because they heard her footsteps, but because they caught a waft of rose oil mixed with something darker, something foreign, something expensive. That scent was her shield, her calling card, her brand. It was carefully engineered to overwhelm, to announce without speaking, to leave a trail of memory in every room she passed through. This was not luxury. This was a strategy. Foreign envoys would later write about the atmosphere of the English court. They spoke not just of the splendour, but of the intensity of the air. It was scented like a temple, they said, or a market in Damascus, or a funeral in July. None of those were compliments, but they were all signs that the Queen's presence had been felt, in a time when letters took weeks to arrive and messages could be forged. A person's smell was strangely reliable. If you were important, you smelled like it. Not just well-groomed, not just pleasant, but rich, complicated, designed. And in this court, no one smelled more deliberate than Elizabeth. Her choice of fragrance changed with the seasons, or the politics. Spikenard and saffron during tense negotiations, lavender and orange blossom when meeting suitors. When she feared betrayal, she leaned into frankincense and bitter herbs, as if warning everyone in the room without saying a word, and those choices were noticed. Diplomats tried to mimic them. hoping to flatter her nose if not her ears. Some succeeded, others overdid it, stepping into the audience chamber smelling like a spice market on fire. These accidents were never mentioned aloud, but they were remembered. Perfume was a delicate game. One misstep and you smelled desperate. At state banquets, the fragrance war escalated. The room pulsed with layers of scent, fighting to dominate. The Queen's tablecloths were soaked in rosewater. Her silverware was wiped with orange oil, her gloves reeking of ambergris. The entire affair was less about food and more about breath control. Those who couldn't handle it coughed quietly behind their napkins and hoped no one noticed. It wasn't just about excess. It was about control. If Elizabeth's scent could fill a room, it meant the room was hers. If her presence could be felt through the nose, even before a word was spoken, then her power was complete. Even in paintings, artists tried to capture it. They gave her powdered skin, perfumed gloves, a faint mist of something invisible hovering around her image. Viewers centuries later don't notice it, but the people who stood near her did. They knew that being close to the Queen meant inhaling her rules. The court adjusted accordingly. Meetings were scheduled after baths. Visitors were warned to wear scent, but not too much. Maids walked behind the Queen carrying sachets of dried herbs, just in case the air needed adjusting. The Privy Council debated policy in rooms thick with orris root and burning resin. Decisions were made through clouds of perfume. Rebellion, when it came, had to pass through lavender. It is easy, now, to laugh at it all, to imagine a monarch obsessed with smell, as if fragrance could hold a kingdom together. But in her world, it did. Scent was loyalty. Scent was obedience. Scent was fear, hope, and command, all rolled into one invisible veil. And it worked. Because in a time before microphones, before headlines, before photography, the Queen's scent was her first impression and her lasting legacy. No one forgot it, not even those who tried. And as we drift deeper into this world of aromas and illusions, it becomes clear. The court wasn't just a place of beauty and power. It was a battlefield of scent, and at the very top of it all stood a woman who understood that sometimes the best way to silence a room was to overwhelm it without a single word. There was a moment, just after entering the Great Hall, when the air itself seemed to pause. It didn't move like normal air. It didn't feel fresh or free. It pressed in on the skin, thick and warm, as if it had been used too many times by too many lungs. And then, the scents arrived, not one by one, but all at once. A storm of roses, musk, cloves, wine, old fabric, incense, and something darker, sour and sweet at the same time. This was not an accident. This was court life in full bloom. Each person who stepped through those velvet-draped doors brought their contribution to the royal bouquet. A duke might wear rosewater in his beard, with a hint of brandy on his breath. A lady-in-waiting might smell like pressed violets and the garlic from yesterday's stew. Some carried notes of sandalwood and frankincense. Others, less lucky, carried the scent of mildew, damp shoes, or a too long-worn corset. No one noticed anymore. It was the background noise of the nose. A shared, silent agreement to pretend everything smelled fine. This mixture, this grand pot of humanity's best and worst, became a kind of identity. Foreign ambassadors wrote about it in coded language. They called it the warm atmosphere or the richness of presence. But everyone knew what it meant. You couldn't stand in the middle of Elizabeth's court for more than a few minutes without inhaling decades of layered smells, embedded in wood, velvet, and flesh. The fireplaces helped a little. The scent of burning oak or sweet-smelling peat sometimes cut through the fog, but only briefly. The heat made it worse, lifting old smells from carpets and cushions like steam from a bath, and the perfumes, meant to mask everything, only made it more complicated. A bad smell covered in lavender is still a bad smell, just more floral. Servants tried to manage the chaos, They hung bundles of dried herbs in corners, stuffed mint leaves behind tapestries, and even walked the halls waving little pots of smouldering resin. But it was like trying to perfume a battlefield. The stench always won. Yet, strangely, no one seemed offended. Not really. This was how things were. Just as the Queen's scent was a declaration of power, the court's collective aroma was a declaration of presence. You were here. You existed. You were part of the machine. And like any great machine, it ran hot, noisy, and not always clean. People adapted. They learned to hold their breath at just the right moment, to tilt their head away politely during a whisper, to pretend not to notice when someone near them smelled of damp wool and sour wine. Etiquette manuals never mentioned smell directly, but everyone knew the dance, the pause, the breath, the smile. Clothing contributed too. Layers and layers of it. Cloaks are rarely cleaned, gloves worn over and over. Undergarments soaked in sweat were then powdered and reused. The fabrics themselves took on a life of their own, holding the history of their wearers in every thread. You could smell a man's station, his breakfast, his anxiety, just by walking past his coat. And then there were the occasional surprises, a whiff of something unfamiliar, a sharp note of decay, a reminder that the human body, no matter how gilded or powdered, was still a body. Once, a visiting noble fainted in a side room, not from emotion, but from a sudden shift in scent too strong to explain. No one laughed. They understood. It could happen to anyone. Even the Queen wasn't immune. Though her scent was tightly controlled, the air around her wasn't. Courtiers crowded close, their aromas colliding like wayward ships. One advisor, it was whispered, had a personal musk so persistent it outlasted his presence by nearly an hour. He was eventually reassigned to outdoor duties. In this court, smell was part of memory. You didn't just recall a conversation. You remembered how it smelled. The cinnamon on a diplomat's breath, the decay of an aging lord's robes, the sharp citrus trailing behind a rising favourite. These things lingered longer than words, and yet, for all its pungency, no one tried to change it. Cleanliness was not the goal. Survival was. The image was. And in the hierarchy of needs, the comfort of one's nose ranked far below the comfort of one's crown. So the court endured. They powdered and perfumed, layered and masked, breathed shallowly and smiled often, because the smells were not a failure of the system. They were the system, a living map of power, privilege, and proximity. And as we move forward, deeper into the rituals of daily life in Elizabeth's world, that truth remains. Behind the painted faces and embroidered gowns, behind the politics and pageantry, was always the same inescapable reality. Everyone smelled, and everyone pretended they didn't. There is something strangely theatrical about the way Queen Elizabeth then presented herself to the world. It wasn't just about power or control. It was about maintaining an image so carefully crafted, so obsessively preserved, that even the dirt underneath had to sparkle somehow. This was not a woman. This was a symbol, a carefully powdered ghost in a gown that rustled with mythology. People didn't bow to her flesh and blood. They bowed to an illusion wrapped in silk and legend, and that illusion had to smell pleasant, even if it sat on top of weeks-old sweat. Each morning, her attendants prepared the stage. They didn't simply dress her, they assembled her. First came the base, the skin. It had to appear pale, smooth, and unblemished. Not because she liked the colour, but because paleness meant virtue, chastity, superiority over those labouring outdoors under the sun. So they painted her face with a thick layer of Venetian ceruse, a delightful combination of white lead and vinegar. It cracked over time, but no one dared point it out. To the outside eye, it was just porcelain beauty. To anyone up close, it was a delicate crust of poison, a mask that grew heavier each year. And then, the blush. Not the gentle kind you see on modern cheeks. No, this was made from cinnabar or vermilion, containing mercury. It gave her a radiant flush, but it slowly gnawed at her nerves. The toxic pigments may have enhanced her glow, but they also brought tremors, insomnia, and God knows what else. Yet no one dared whisper of consequences. The Queen was never tired. She was merely thoughtful. She was not unwell, just contemplative. Her eyebrows, thin and meticulously shaped, were often enhanced with soot or dyed materials. In portraits, they looked elegant. In person, perhaps a little off. But again, who would dare say it? She could have walked into a room with a smear of coal under each eye, and courtiers would have called it divine fashion. That's the thing about power. It doesn't need to be pretty, it only needs to be unquestioned. What truly kept the illusion afloat, though, was the lighting. You see, no one ever saw Elizabeth under the harshness of midday sun. Audiences were granted in rooms lit by candlelight or filtered through heavy drapes. Soft shadows masked the inconsistencies in her painted face. The flickering glow made her skin shimmer just enough to distract from the dry patches, the flaking layers, the quiet cracking of lead-based glamour. Even the very idea of mirrors was controlled. There were few in her private spaces, and the ones that did exist, likely carefully placed, lit from forgiving angles. It wasn't just others who had to believe the illusion. She had to believe it too, or at least believe in the importance of it. Because once the image cracked, even slightly, everything might crumble with it. And crumble it would, if people ever saw the reality. Under the layers of makeup was a woman aging rapidly. Her teeth were decaying, her skin pocked from a past bout with smallpox. Her hair, once a fiery red, had thinned to the point that wigs became necessary. But the story could not allow for decline, so she became something else entirely. A statue in motion, a walking, scented painting. It is tempting to feel sympathy, and perhaps we should, but it is equally important to recognise the role she played in preserving this charade. She demanded it, enforced it, built systems around it. Her ladies-in-waiting were instructed to never speak of what they saw. Courtiers knew to compliment rather than comment. The entire court became a supporting cast in a never-ending play called The Virgin Queen. This was not hygiene as we know it today. This was ritual, not about cleanliness, but about meaning. The scent of lavender didn't mean she was fresh, it meant she was untouchable. The smoothness of her gowns didn't suggest comfort, it suggested purity. Even when she was unwell, she had to appear invincible. The illusion was stronger than the body. The story is more sacred than the truth. It is no surprise, then, that historians today often struggle to separate the real Elizabeth from the image she curated. Was she confident or just cornered by expectation? Was she proud or imprisoned by the role she created? Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. Perhaps she was simply too deep into the act to stop performing. Even her portraits lied. Artists were instructed to enhance her features, idealize her complexion, and elongate her neck. The Queen had final approval. If a painting showed too much humanity, it was discarded. Only the divine could remain. Only the flawless. Imagine being so powerful that even your likeness had to lie for you. And yet, behind closed doors, she must have felt the weight of it. The hours were spent sitting still while paint dried on her face. The stiffness of heavily embroidered gowns. The endless layers of artifice that felt more like armour than attire. And still, she persisted. Not just because she wanted to, because she had to. In a world where a woman's authority was constantly questioned, the performance of perfection was a necessity. If she faltered, even for a moment, they might pounce. So she smiled, stood tall, wore white, glowed like a pearl even as her body begged for rest. It is ironic, of course, that what we now admire, the strength, the image, the mystique, was born from powders and perfumes, from sweat hidden beneath silk. from routines so suffocating they would make a modern beauty influencer weep. Yet, we remember the icon, not the effort, the scent, not the sweat. And maybe that's what she wanted, to be remembered as more than a person, to be remembered as present, as Myeth, as something clean, controlled, and eternally untouched. But under all that powder, Elizabeth was still human, and if her skin could speak, it might tell a different story. People in Elizabethan times didn't fear germs because they didn't even know such things existed. What they did fear, however, was something far more familiar to their noses than to their minds. They believed that disease came from foul air, from invisible clouds of stink drifting through cities, palaces, and open fields. This belief was known as the miasma theory, and for centuries it shaped everything from architecture to personal hygiene. If the air around you smelled bad, it was considered dangerous. If it smelled good, it was safe. That was the logic. Simple, wrong, but comforting enough to become a way of life. In a court obsessed with appearances, this idea flourished. Bad smells were not only unpleasant, they were a sign of corruption, sin, or sickness. Good smells, on the other hand, meant purity, control, and most importantly, health. This belief allowed people to live with filth as long as it didn't reek too much, and if it did, they would cover it with something floral. That is where the perfume came in. The more extravagant the odour, the more protected you were thought to be. Elizabeth Fierce, of course, was not going to risk her public image by smelling like the gutters of London. Her court was drenched in perfumes, salves, herbal sachets, and scented candles. The belief was not that these things made her clean, it was that they kept illness away. They were talismans more than tools. Walls were hung with bundles of dried lavender. Carpets were sprinkled with rose water. Even gloves were soaked in musk and ambergris. The result was not so much cleanliness as confusion. The room smelled like a garden, but the walls were mouldy, the floors were stained, and the corners harboured more life than one would care to name. Still, they trusted their noses. Scent was their compass, their early warning system, their fragile line of defence. And when Elizabeth floated past, trailing jasmine and civet, people believed they were in the presence of not just royalty, but safety. Of course, the truth was less poetic. Underneath the layers of perfume, the Queen's world was just as ripe with disease as any commoner's hut. The drains were crude, the water stagnant, and rats were regular palace guests. But as long as the air didn't smell of death, people convinced themselves it wasn't there. The irony is almost unbearable. They worked so hard to smell nice while ignoring the very real problems around them. They thought that if something didn't stink, it couldn't possibly hurt them. It was a perfume-scented denial of reality. And to be fair, it wasn't entirely their fault. They didn't have microscopes. They didn't understand infection. They didn't know that cholera doesn't need an odour to kill you, that typhus doesn't announce itself with a foul breeze. Instead, they fought invisible threats with visible rituals. Herbal smoke in the hallways, orange peels in windows, bags of dried rose petals tied to the wrist. These weren't just habits, they were hopes, desperate, well-scented hopes that the world made more sense than it did. Even Elizabeth, with all her education and access to the finest physicians, leaned on this belief. She clung to her scented gloves and her rosewater rinses as if they could keep decay at bay. And in some twisted way, they did. Not medically, of course, but socially. The Queen smelled better than the peasants, so she must have been healthier. Smell became status. A noble's worth could be guessed by their aroma. Musk for the powerful, spices for the well-connected, and for those without means, the scent of sweat, smoke, and whatever else the day dragged in. Cleanliness was never about hygiene. It was about hierarchy. In a world where diseases had no names and symptoms were often misread as divine punishment. Scent gave people a sense of control. It allowed them to believe they could fight back. One extra handful of dried mint in your pillow, one more splash of lavender on your collar. These were the shields they raised each morning, not because they were effective, but because they were all they had. Looking back now, it's easy to scoff, to roll our eyes at their ignorance. But are we so different? We still associate cleanliness with smell. Fresh linen, lemon disinfectant, minty breath. We buy candles and air fresheners that promise serenity and scent. We cover the smell of reality just like they did, with prettier illusions. The only real difference is that now we know what we're hiding. Elizabeth's court didn't have that luxury. They couldn't Google the symptoms of plague. They couldn't sanitize a room with the press of a button. They had bundles of time and hope, and the belief that if they could make the world smell like a meadow, it might just behave like one. It didn't. Of course. Diseases spread anyway. People died anyway, but at least they died believing they had tried. There's something heartbreakingly human in that, in trusting what your nose tells you, even when your eyes see otherwise, in pouring all your fear into a bottle of rose oil and hoping it's enough. So the palace remained fragrant. It shimmered with the illusion of purity. Elizabeth remained the scented sovereign, floating above the stench of her own crumbling infrastructure. The air was filled with cloves and chamomile, while the drains gurgled with things best left unmentioned. It was a world dressed in perfume and denial, and maybe that's why it lasted, because it smelled better than the truth. She may have ruled with a steady hand, but Elizabeth's body told a different story. By the time her image had become almost mythical, white-faced, flame-haired, untouched by time, her teeth were rotting beneath the surface, her bones ached with every step, and fevers came and went like uninvited guests. But the show had to go on. In a court built on appearances, pain had no place, so she hid it, not just from her people, but from her closest advisors, her courtiers, and sometimes, perhaps, from herself. Each morning she put on the armour of royalty, thick layers of lead-based makeup, dresses stiff with embroidery and perfume, and the practiced smile of someone who knew her presence was more powerful than her pulse. Toothaches were ignored. Exhaustion was masked beneath powdered cheeks. She stood through ceremonies with clenched jaws and eyes that gave away nothing. Even when fever burned through her body, she insisted on being seen, dressed in white, looking like a ghost of strength. But flesh has limits, even when dressed in velvet. When her body gave out, when she could no longer manage to sit through another meeting or stand through another procession, she retreated, not to a hospital or an infirmary, but to her private chambers, where only a small circle of trusted attendants and physicians were allowed. The curtains would close, and outside the walls of her room, rumours would begin. She was resting. She was tired. She had a cold. Anything but the truth, because the truth would have been too human. Inside those chambers, the Queen stopped being a symbol and started being a patient. She winced as infected teeth throbbed through sleepless nights. She sweated through linen sheets soaked in rosewater, hoping the scent would fool her senses into calm. And when the pain grew unbearable, she reached for what little comfort the era could offer, a pouch of cloves to bite down on, a glass of spiced wine laced with opium. Bundles of dried herbs were crushed into poultices and pressed to her temples. These were her tools, primitive, fragrant, and slightly magical. Not because they worked, but because they helped her believe they might. Doctors in Elizabeth's time were more confident than competent. They wore ruffled collars and carried vials of potions that promised relief but rarely delivered. They spoke in terms of humours and balances, not bacteria or viruses. The Queen's physician, though discreet, was part of this same system. He prescribed what he could: oils to rub on her temples, powders to stir into her wine, and sometimes simply silence. He knew that most of what she needed was not to be seen this way, and so Outside her chamber, the story continued. The Queen is radiant. The Queen is strong. The Queen is eternal. Inside, she lay on a silk-draped bed, pressing clove oil to her gums and trying not to cry when she swallowed, because crying was not queenly. Pain was not queenly. And admitting weakness could unravel the entire illusion she had built over decades. She wasn't just a woman. She was England. But no illusion holds forever. Over time, people noticed small cracks. Her voice, once clear and commanding, trembled slightly. Her posture, once upright and proud, slouched more often. Her public appearances grew shorter, and her silences longer. Still, no one dared speak the obvious. No one mentioned the swelling in her cheeks or the pallor beneath her powder. It was understood to acknowledge the Queen's suffering was to risk being reminded of everyone's mortality, and that simply wouldn't do. Even as the pain deepened, Elizabeth remained committed to the performance. Her dresses grew heavier, her jewels more extravagant, her wigs taller and more absurd. It was as if she thought that by adding more layers, she could hold herself together. But the truth was simpler and sadder. She was tired. Not just from age or illness, but from the endless need to pretend. In the quiet of her room, she sometimes held on to the familiar scents that had accompanied her all her life. Lavender crushed between her fingers. Sage hung near the fireplace, the bitter edge of poppy syrup coating her tongue. They weren't just comforts. They were constants in a world where everything else was slipping away. Her body, her strength, even the loyalty of her courtiers, who were already whispering about succession. Some say she fought death with pride. Others say she simply refused to admit defeat. But perhaps it was neither. Perhaps she just didn't know how to stop being queen. The crown had become her skin, and removing it meant revealing what was underneath a tired, aching woman who had long since run out of strength but still showed up because that's what the role demanded. By the end, even her physicians couldn't do much more than watch. The opiates dulled her senses, but the infection in her mouth never fully went away. Her nights were restless, her dreams fogged with fever and regret. She no longer trusted mirrors. She no longer trusted her own reflection. Instead, she surrounded herself with symbols, paintings, music, candles, and fragrance. Anything that reminded her of who she had been. Anything that made her feel less like a patient and more like a queen. Looking at it now, it feels both tragic and predictable. Of course, she hid it. Of course, she denied it. Because in her world, vulnerability wasn't just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. A queen who limped was a queen who could be replaced. A queen who winced in pain was a queen who invited questions. So she smiled through rotting teeth and stood through waves of nausea. And when it became too much, she vanished behind scented curtains and let the legend take over. In the end, her greatest act wasn't in how she led or how she fought. It was in how she managed to be so profoundly human while convincing the world she wasn't. All it took was a little perfume, a little poppy, and a lot of pretending. Of all the things Elizabeth sacrificed for her crown, perhaps the most painful was the right to appear unwell. Her kingdom could bear storms and rebellions, but the sight of a faltering monarch was unthinkable. In her world, sickness was not just an inconvenience. It was a threat to power, a blemish on the illusion she had so carefully constructed. So, she refused to show it. Her health declined quietly, behind doors that rarely opened, while the woman herself continued to glide through ceremonies, draped in satin, painted in powder, and smiling through the ache. Her image mattered more than her comfort. When her legs grew weak and her spine stiffened, she chose heels instead of slippers. When her jaw throbbed with pain, she chose laughter over silence. And when her pulse fluttered irregularly in her neck, she stood straighter, held her chin higher, and pretended that the world beneath her feet was as steady as ever. She did not limp. She did not lean. And if she stumbled, It was because the floor was uneven, not because her body was betraying her. White gowns became her signature, not because they were practical or flattering, but because they made her look like something beyond human. They shimmered under candlelight, reflected purity, and whispered of invincibility. No one wanted to imagine their queen curled in bed, clutching at her ribs or moaning from a toothache. They wanted a statue, a presence, a myth brought to life. And Elizabeth gave it to them, every single day. The court played its part too. They bowed a little lower when she seemed tired. They laughed a little louder when her voice cracked. No one dared speak of the sweat that beaded on her forehead, or the trembling in her hands. Those details were quietly ignored, brushed aside like crumbs from the banquet table. It was understood that keeping the illusion alive was a shared responsibility. To serve the crown was to protect its dignity, even when the body beneath it was falling apart. Behind closed doors, however, the work of concealment was exhausting. Her maids were tasked not only with dressing her, but with disguising the physical toll of her age. Corsets were tightened to force a straighter posture. Extra padding was sewn into her gowns to create the illusion of fullness where there was now frailty. Makeup was applied not just to beautify, but to hide. Rouge for the cheeks, chalk for the jawline, and a thin layer of gloss on the lips to mask how dry they had become. Every appearance was a performance. The makeup room was her backstage, the corridors of Whitehall were her stage, and the eyes of England were her audience. Even when she could barely lift her arms to wave, she still waved. Even when her teeth ached so badly she could not chew, she sat at banquets and picked at her food, pretending to enjoy the feast. There was a script to follow, and she knew every line by heart. Sometimes, she sat for portraits during these low moments. Artists were instructed to paint her youth, not her truth. They smoothed the wrinkles, brightened the eyes, and erased the veins on her hands. The result was a woman who had long since disappeared from the mirror, but that woman still ruled in oil and canvas, frozen in time, forever untouched. These portraits became the propaganda of strength, reinforcing what her body could no longer uphold, and still, she kept going. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps it was fear, or perhaps she simply did not know how to be anything but queen, to step away, to rest, to admit weakness, felt like opening the door to chaos. She had reigned for so long that her presence had become the foundation of stability. If she faltered, who else might follow? So she bore it. The back pain, the headaches, the fatigue that seeped into her bones like cold rain. She bore it with grace, with stubbornness, and with an uncanny ability to pretend that everything was fine. Even when the audience was just a handful of courtiers in a drafty hall, she still gave them the queen they expected, and they, in turn, never asked for more. There was something almost tragic in this pact. A court that could not speak the truth, a monarch who could not show it, and a country that preferred illusion to reality. It was not that people did not care about her health. They simply did not want to see it. They had been taught to associate her with permanence. To admit her mortality was to shatter the very idea of Elizabeth. In private, some whispered concerns. A few old advisers exchanged glances when she stumbled. One or two maids wept quietly when they changed the linen soaked in sweat. But none of it reached the surface. None of it ever touched the public stage. Elizabeth remained untouched. Or so it seemed. From a distance, her court looked like a celebration. But close up, it was a balancing act. Everyone walked carefully. Everyone avoided the cracks. The throne was still upright, but the floor beneath it creaked, and the queen, magnificent as ever, stood right in the centre, smiling, nodding, commanding, while pretending not to feel it shake. In a way, this was her final triumph. Not the wars she won or the enemies she outwitted, but this, the sheer willpower to keep standing when every part of her body asked to sit, the courage to keep performing when the curtain should have closed, and the dignity to make sure that when she finally left the stage, it would be with applause, not pity. As we move toward what came next, one thing becomes clear. Elizabeth's image did not outlive her by accident. It was carefully constructed, fiercely maintained, and painfully worn. She gave everything to it, even when there was very little left to give, and in doing so, she ensured that history would remember the Queen, not the woman. The icon, not the aches, the legend, not the loneliness. They say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but in the royal court of Elizabeth I, it was more like a survival strategy. If the Queen wore a certain scent, so did her courtiers. If she pursed her lips a particular way when thinking, you could bet half the council would be seen doing the same within the week. They copied her not just out of admiration, but because it became the unspoken rule of how to stay relevant, how to remain in favour, and, perhaps most importantly, how to keep one's head securely on one's shoulders. The Queen's habits filtered down through the palace like perfume through silk, gowns embroidered with satiny trim, gloves laced with essential oils, speech patterns as carefully arranged as a banquet table. Her favourites led the charge, adopting her mannerisms with theatrical precision, and soon the rest followed, whether they liked it or not. There was no formal decree that said, "Speak like the Queen," but everyone understood it just the same. Her way of speaking became court language, her posture became court etiquette, and her scent, well, that became court atmosphere. It started subtly, a head tilt, a hand flourish, a carefully timed pause in conversation. Then came the gloves, not just any gloves, of course, but gloves soaked in rose oil, trimmed with lace, and stored in sachets of crushed lavender. After a while, entering the council chamber began to feel like walking into a perfumery. The air was heavy with florals, spices, and something more musky lingering underneath. Some of the older gentlemen took to it with quiet reluctance, dabbing just a touch of perfume on their cuffs and hoping it would be enough. The younger ones, however, embraced the trend with dangerous enthusiasm. One unfortunate young lord, desperate to impress at a royal banquet, reportedly doused himself in so much musk and ambergris that he nearly passed out before dessert. His doublet reeked for days, causing several nearby servants to gag during morning prayers, and once, according to a half-whispered tale that was never officially confirmed, the sleeve of his embroidered coat caught the edge of a candle. With all that oil and powder clinging to his clothes, he went up like a bonfire in a churchyard. Luckily, he survived with only singed pride and a new nickname that followed him for the rest of his career. No one told him to stop. Instead, the story passed through the palace halls like a cautionary joke, not about overdoing the scent, but about standing too close to candles. The lesson was not to be less fragrant, but to be more careful with open flames. To be fair, the Queen herself had created this environment. She had made fragrance a symbol of taste, rank, and refinement. It was never just about smelling pleasant. It was about sending a message. I am above the filth. I am beyond decay. My body does not rot. It glows. It sparkles. It smells of roses and spice, not of sweat or mortality. And if the Queen smelled this way, then her council had better keep up. They mimicked her in other ways too, her pacing, her phrasing, her habit of tapping a ringed finger against the armrest when bored. Some adopted her cautious diplomacy, pausing just long enough before answering questions to seem clever, even when they weren't. Others practiced the art of seeming disinterested while intensely listening, a skill the Queen had perfected over years of managing liars and flatterers. In meetings, her courtiers began to echo her turns of phrase, sometimes unintentionally, sometimes with such exaggeration that it was hard not to smirk. A few took it too far. There were attempts to recreate her legendary wardrobe choices. One lord arrived in a white satin ensemble so heavily powdered that his shoulders resembled pastry tops. Another tried to replicate the Queen's distinct high ruff. only to find himself unable to turn his head without poking the Earl next to him in the eye. But these were accepted as signs of loyalty, not mockery. Everyone understood that looking ridiculous was a small price to pay for royal favour. Even their laughter changed. Elizabeth had a particular way of chuckling at courtly wit, a controlled, melodic sound that never shook her shoulders. Soon, the council chamber echoed with a chorus of imitations. Deep belly laughs were considered vulgar. Instead, humour was acknowledged with refined chuckles, polite nods, and the occasional raise of a perfumed handkerchief. The effect was surreal. An entire room full of grown men and women subtly pretending to be one woman, their individuality gently set aside, not out of fear exactly, but out of devotion to the strange theatre they had built together. To belong, one had to blend in. To stand out, one had to imitate her perfectly. And so, the council became a mirror, each reflection slightly warped, but unmistakably modelled after the same image. The palace grew quieter in its absurdity. The louder the scents became, the more controlled the movements, the bolder the outfits, the softer the voices. It was as though they were all performing inside a glass box, pretending not to sweat, not to age, not to think about the rot beneath the floorboards or the aches in their knees. The Queen had taught them well. Decay, after all, was not to be acknowledged. It was to be perfumed and ignored. And yet, there was something tragically amusing about the whole act. Here was a group of powerful nobles dressed in silks and sprayed with musk, tiptoeing through history in the hopes of staying in character. One wrong scent, one misplaced gesture, and they might find themselves on the outside, not banished, perhaps, but quietly forgotten, lost beneath the powder and perfume of someone else's shadow. It worked. For a time. The illusion held. The Queen remained the sun, and her court spun around her, golden and sweet-smelling and slightly flammable. But behind the scents and the smiles, there lingered a quiet truth that no rose oil could mask. They were all afraid of losing status, of aging, of being seen for what they were, just people, sweaty, flawed, aging people, and that, more than anything, kept them reaching for the perfume. For all the grandeur of Elizabethan architecture, there was one thing noticeably absent from the Queen's long list of priorities: proper sewage. The Queen, ever meticulous about her appearance and the scent of her court, somehow managed to look the other way when it came to the royal latrines. Pipes, drains, and underground flow systems were considered the domain of plumbers and peasants, not queens. And Elizabeth, let's be honest, would much rather commission another portrait of herself draped in silk than approve funding for a new drainage system under Whitehall. While court painters were busy immortalising her in luminous white gowns, the corridors beneath her feet were quietly fermenting, a mix of urine, human waste, kitchen runoff, and the occasional dead rat made its sluggish way through a series of outdated channels, many of which had cracked or collapsed altogether. But the Queen's attention was firmly fixed above ground. Tapestries, jewellery, royal festivities. These were the things that mattered, not the faint but persistent scent of rot curling up through the floorboards. It wasn't that the issue went unnoticed. Courtiers occasionally commented in the most delicate terms possible on the peculiar smells near certain stairwells or the damp feeling in the hallway by the West Wing. A visiting ambassador once described the palace as sumptuous, though with a certain earthy vigour in the air. But Elizabeth, always more focused on perception than plumbing, treated the problem as one might treat a draught by closing a window and pretending it had vanished. The money was there. Let's not pretend England couldn't afford a few new pipes. But the Queen had a different kind of legacy in mind. In her view, the court should shimmer with light and luxury, not stink of lead work and trench digging. And so the funds were funneled toward lavish banquets, pageants, and fabrics imported from Italy, while the smell beneath the palace slowly climbed the stairs like an uninvited guest. To her credit, She did try to mask the issue in her way. More herbs, more incense, more bowls of dried flowers were strategically placed in corners. Lavender sprigs tied in silk ribbons dangled from curtain rods. Juniper smoke was wafted through halls before important audiences. It was like trying to fix a cracked wall by hanging up a larger painting. You couldn't see the damage, but you could still smell it. Some rooms were worse than others. The antechamber near the kitchens had a reputation for sudden gusts of sulphur. On warm days, the privy near the chapel gave off a smell so potent that even the most loyal clergymen cut their prayers short. Servants took to scattering rosemary along the flagstones and crushing mint underfoot as they walked, hoping to release enough scent to mask the unpleasantness. It helped. Barely. But in the grand scheme of court life, the smell became just another part of the atmosphere, a background note, like candle smoke or damp stone. What's surprising is how few people complained. Perhaps they were too afraid, or perhaps, like many who spend long enough in a bad smell, they simply got used to it. When everything is drenched in perfume and formality, even sewage becomes part of the ceremony. The nobles held their lace handkerchiefs a little closer to their noses. The servants learned which corners to avoid, and the queen, wrapped in her cloud of musk and orange blossom, probably couldn't smell it at all. There was something almost poetic about it, a palace built on gold, pageantry, and the quiet gurgle of waste. Beneath the gilded ceilings, beneath the satin slippers, the underbelly of the court bubbled with reminders of real life. No matter how high a ruff was starched, or how thick the powder, the earth had a way of making itself known, and Elizabeth's refusal to deal with it was both completely understandable and deeply revealing. After all, it was never just about comfort. It was about the image. Fixing the sewers wouldn't earn her praise. No foreign envoy would write home about the new drainage system, but a glowing portrait with 36 hand-stitched pearls on the collar. That they would remember. That would echo through history. And so the Queen chose beauty over utility, perfume over sanitation. It wasn't unusual for her time. It was rather expected. Hygiene was a vague, suspicious concept, while extravagance was a clear statement of power. A clean-smelling monarch was considered elegant. A monarch who cleaned things, that was unbecoming. And yet, the irony remained. In trying to escape the filth of ordinary life, Elizabeth built her court atop a steadily growing problem, one that couldn't be painted over or perfumed into submission forever. The palace's scent, carefully crafted with oils and herbs, still couldn't fully silence the stink beneath the floor, but no one dared mention it too loudly, because the Queen didn't want to hear about drains. She wanted to hear poetry. She wanted to dance in gowns so heavy they needed 3 servants to lift them. She wanted to smell of rose and cinnamon and never be told otherwise. And in a way, her courtiers were happy to oblige. Better to drown in fragrance than risk offending the Queen by suggesting she was quite literally standing in a sewer. Every morning in Elizabeth's court began with a performance. Before a single word was spoken or a scroll unrolled, the Queen's body had to be carefully assembled, one scented layer at a time. It started with powder, not the kind you pat lightly onto your cheeks in front of a bathroom mirror, but a thick chalky layer of white lead, applied until every trace of human complexion disappeared. The paleness wasn't just a beauty choice, it was a declaration. I am untouched, I am untouchable, I am not like you. Then came the rouge, a rich, dangerous red made from mercury-laced cinnabar, dabbed onto cheeks that sometimes trembled from fever or toothache. Her lips were drawn carefully, with more pigment than any flower dared wear. These weren't cosmetics. They were armour. The cracks in her skin were covered with gloss. The dark circles under her eyes were hidden beneath ground pearls. Even her exhaustion had to be powdered until it looked regal. The fragrance followed. And it was never a modest affair. Musk, ambergris, clove, orange blossom, violet, and rose all mingled in strange combinations. each chosen to overpower whatever might be lingering beneath the layers of cloth and cosmetics. Perfume was not applied delicately. It was poured, rubbed, fanned, and finally sprayed in bursts until the room itself reeked of majesty. After that came the dressing. The gowns were massive, heavy with embroidery, pearls, and expectation. Each had to be laced and pinned by attendants who knew better than to speak unless spoken to. Corsets were pulled tight, sleeves were fastened with stiff cuffs that could scratch if handled carelessly. A ruff, large enough to frame the head like a halo, was added last, giving the illusion that the Queen's face floated apart from her body, detached and divine. The gloves, scented and softened with oil, came next. Elizabeth wore them not just for style, but as a barrier between her and the world, between skin and skin. They smelled like lavender and civet, and they reminded everyone who kissed her hand that they were not kissing a woman, but a symbol. All this could take up to 4 hours. It wasn't preparation, it was a ceremony. She wasn't getting dressed, she was becoming herself. And if it sounds exhausting, it was. But no one was allowed to say that. No one was permitted to ask why a woman of intelligence and power needed to be wrapped in lace and powder before speaking to her ministers. Because the image had become more than the person. By the time she emerged from her chambers, the Queen was not a tired woman with aching feet and a mouthful of sore gums. She was the Virgin Queen, regal, radiant, and so heavily adorned she could barely move without assistance. Appearances, in her world, were sacred, more sacred than comfort, more sacred, in some cases, than truth. Hygiene, by this point, had become a ritual. Washing for cleanliness was secondary. What mattered was the illusion of being clean. Hands were wiped with perfumed cloths, faces were blotted, not rinsed, hair was powdered, not washed. To bathe in water was a medical risk, but to be seen looking dull, oily, or heaven forbid, sweaty, was a far worse danger. And so, the court accepted the logic of the age smell nice, and no one will question how long it's been since you last touched soap. The Queen's rituals became the model. Other women, eager to mirror her power, adopted the same routines. They painted their faces until their skin peeled. They perfumed their underarms and behind their ears until the scent clung to the curtains. They wore dresses so stiff and wide they couldn't fit through doors without turning sideways. And they smiled through it all, because that was the job. Not to be comfortable, not even to be clean, but to be beautiful. Always. It would be easy to laugh at it now. To mock the absurdity of a woman needing 5 servants to help her into a corset that would later bruise her ribs. But something about the ritual feels hauntingly familiar. Swap the ruffs and rouge for filters and foundation, and the difference becomes thinner than we'd like to admit. The tools have changed, the pressure hasn't, and perhaps that's the most uncomfortable truth. Elizabeth's mornings weren't just about hygiene, they were about control. In a world that sought to reduce her to a marriage prospect or a royal puppet, she chose to become a spectacle instead. Her look wasn't just vanity, it was power. It was a message. Repeated daily, I may be a woman, but I am your queen. Worship accordingly. So every morning she stood still while her face was reconstructed. Every morning she endured the weight of velvet and velveted deception. And every morning the scent of her arrival drifted through the halls before her first words did. Her presence began with perfume. Her reign was wrapped in fabric and finished with powder. It was a masterpiece of illusion, and yet beneath it all there was still a body, still breath, still sweat, still human limits. But those were hidden behind layers, whispered about in private, and denied in public. Cleanliness wasn't about soap and water. It was about performance. Sanitation wasn't a matter of health. It was a theatre, every day. Elizabeth stepped into the spotlight, powdered to perfection, and pretended she was made of marble, and everyone around her clapped. By the time the powdered veil was set and the ruffled collar pressed flat, Elizabeth's body had long stopped being her own. It belonged to England now, not as a woman, not even as a queen in the personal sense, but as an emblem, a monument, a symbol made flesh, dressed in silver brocade and lacquered in rosewater. There was no room left for imperfection, no space for a body to sweat, ache, or age. She had become the embodiment of chastity, of control, of divinity woven into female form. But being that symbol came with a cost, and not just the morning hours spent transforming herself into an icon. Her skin no longer had the right to break out. Her breath wasn't allowed to smell of illness. Her stomach wasn't permitted to grumble at the wrong time. Cleanliness, or the suggestion of it, became not only a matter of decorum but of national stability. Because if the Virgin Queen was seen as dirty, as human, the illusion would start to crumble. A stain on her gown could ripple through court gossip like wildfire. A yellow tooth or damp armpit might not sound like treason, but when your power is built on image, even the smallest blemish can feel like a threat. Dirt, in this context, wasn't just physical, it was symbolic, and symbols weren't supposed to have pores. So she played her role with dedication. Perfume wasn't just a preference, it was insurance. The layers of lavender, ambergris, and crushed herbs weren't for delight. They were there to hide the danger, to smother any human scent that might betray the fact that beneath the crown sat a body like any other. A body that was tired, a body that ached, a body that could, God forbid, smell. Other women at court took the hint. The expectation wasn't simply to look your best. It was never to appear real. Courtly women stuffed their dresses with sachets and scented wool. They painted over blemishes with lead and wiped their hands with vinegar instead of water. They had learned that being clean was not the same as being seen as clean, and being seen as clean was everything. It's hard to overstate how fragile the balance was. Elizabeth's reign balanced between the reverence of her people and their suspicion of her independence. She had no husband. She had no children. She had only her image and the power it allowed her to hold. A queen who ruled alone needed more than a scepter. She needed myth, and myths cannot sweat. So she polished every surface. Her public addresses were careful performances. Her portraits showed an unchanging mask of youth. Even as her joints stiffened and her teeth fell out, her image remained spotless. The same snow-white face, the same crimson cheeks, the same perfume cloud, walking one step ahead of her. She preserved the story because the story preserved her throne. The tragedy, of course, is how familiar it all still feels. Even now, women's bodies are often treated more like billboards than biology. They are judged for how they appear, not how they feel. Scented, shaven, smooth, and smiling. Whether in royal courts or modern offices, the expectation hasn't fully vanished. The language may have changed, but the demand remains. Elizabeth wasn't the only one trapped in this performance, but she was the one who performed it best, and perhaps that's why she survived. Where other rulers were undone by betrayal or war, she was undone only by time. Her enemies couldn't smell weakness on her because she didn't allow it. She was, to the very end, immaculate. Or at least, she appeared so. Behind the scenes, the labour of this illusion was relentless. Servants rotated out her perfumed gloves. Physicians dabbed scented oils on her temples when the headache struck. She avoided strong sunlight, which might reveal the cracks in her makeup. The illusion was not effortless. It was a full-time job, but the alternative, being seen as merely human, was too risky. So Elizabeth became a body without a body, a presence without a pulse. And in doing so, she reminded everyone else at court that their bodies were liabilities. To be soft, sweaty, or spotted was to be lesser. It was to be vulnerable, and in a court where power clung to those who could hide their flaws best. Smelling like flowers became more than fashion. It became policy. This is why even her bodily functions had to be disguised. Her close stool looked like a padded chair, elegant and unobtrusive. The chamber was aired with dried herbs. The odour was masked with rose vinegar and musk. Nothing unpleasant could be associated with the Queen's person. Not even reality. Especially not reality. In the end, the odour that surrounded her became more than a scent. It was a signal, a warning, a curtain between her and the world. She smelled like a queen because she had to. Because in an era where power didn't forgive weakness, and where women had to fight twice as hard to be taken seriously, a hint of body odour could undo years of diplomacy. And so, while her subjects may have loved her, they did not know her. They knew the image, the ritual, the layers, the legend, the smell of her glove, but not the woman who wore it. Her body had become a battleground of expectations, and somewhere under the lace, beneath the powdered skin, behind the ambergris and rose petals, a real person sat quietly, trapped in silk and story. Elizabeth's hygiene routine wasn't about feeling good, it was about staying untouchable, and as long as the myth smelled sweet, the kingdom stayed intact. Compared to the rest of Tudor England, Elizabeth was practically a saint of cleanliness. While her courtiers layered musk over mildew and the streets of London flowed with waste and rot, the Queen had her version of hygiene. It may not have involved soap and a tub, but it was, for the time, a kind of revolution in rosewater and vinegar. She was meticulous with her linens. Undergarments were changed regularly, a small luxury that only the wealthy could afford. Her handkerchiefs were perfumed and embroidered. She wiped her face and hands with a cloth soaked in rosewater or herbal vinegar, not to remove dirt necessarily, but to refresh the skin and, more importantly, to leave a fragrant barrier between herself and the world. The court, of course, considered this refined. No one expected the Queen to scrub herself with hot water or scrub her feet in a wooden basin. That was for peasants. Instead, she relied on scented gloves. Gloves she changed often, each pair steeped in lavender or cloves. Her face never bore the oil or grime of the day because it was constantly covered in layers of chalky white and pearl dust. The powder kept her dry. The powder kept her regal. The powder also clogged every pore. Bathing in water, at least with full immersion, was considered dangerous. Doctors warned that warm water opened the pores, allowing disease to slip inside the body. This belief, absurd as it sounds now, was widespread. So Elizabeth avoided it, not because she didn't want to be clean, but because she wanted to stay alive. She did, however, occasionally take what were known as sweating baths, steam-based treatments with herbs and towels, intended more to purge illness than remove grime. Think of it as a royal sauna without the rinse. Her preference for vinegar was practical and fragrant. Vinegar infused with rose petals or thyme was used for everything, wiping her face, rinsing her hands, cleaning her close stool, even dabbing her temples during headaches. The smell cut through whatever the court might be exhaling, and its sharpness gave an illusion of purity. She smelled like vinegar and roses. It was oddly appropriate, and yes, by Elizabethan standards, this was clean, especially when you consider what most people were doing, or rather, not doing. Down in the countryside, peasants shared beds with livestock for warmth. Their clothes were worn until stiff, their hands rarely saw clean water, and their diets made their breath sharp with onions and ale. Soap was homemade, harsh, and often reserved for laundry, not skin. Baths were seasonal, not daily. Many believed water itself could make you sick. In that context, the Queen's perfumed gloves and rose-scented vinegar made her a model of royal hygiene. Still, let's not get carried away. Clean was relative. Elizabeth's wigs were never washed. Her corsets went unlaundered. Her heavy gowns were brushed, not rinsed. And the white paint on her face was made from lead, which slowly poisoned her over the decades. But the important thing wasn't actual sanitation. It was the performance of it, the illusion. In a world where most people reeked of dirt, sweat, and death, she managed to smell like a bottle of diluted heaven. It's tempting to romanticize this, to imagine her as a forward-thinking woman in a backward time. But hygiene wasn't her rebellion, it was her defense against disease. Yes, but more importantly, against judgment. A queen without a husband had to be more than respectable. She had to be immaculate. She had to be mythic. No odours, no stains, no weakness, just silk, powder, and the faint scent of crushed violets. If she had done less, people would have talked. If she had smelled like the streets outside or her mortality, they would have whispered. Instead, they inhaled musk and civet and declared her divine. She made her body into an altar and her scent into a sermon. Compared to the rest of Europe's muddy, bleeding monarchs, she floated. Even her enemies, foreign ambassadors and rival nobles, commented on the atmosphere around her. They didn't always admire her policies, but they noticed her presence. It arrived before her, clinging to tapestries, lingering on chairs. The smell of the Queen became a political fact. If England was to be respected, Elizabeth had to remain untouchable, and untouchable women do not stink. It's a bit funny, in a dark way. The woman who spent her life refusing to marry was nonetheless forced to maintain herself like a bride on permanent display. Every morning, she prepared her body for inspection. Every evening, she removed the layers of self-preservation, and in between, she ruled an empire, while smelled like a bouquet that had been dipped in the vinegar and prayer. So yes, Elizabeth was clean. Clean enough to stand out, clean enough to be remembered, clean enough to survive in a world that didn't expect women, especially women in power, to be clean at all. But don't confuse that for comfort. Don't mistake the scent of lavender for rest. Hers was a cleanliness born of pressure, a cleanliness built on fear, a cleanliness that left no space for sweat, nor breath, nor mistakes. And that, perhaps, is what makes her so fascinating. She managed to stay clean in the dirtiest of times, not because she loved cleanliness, but because she needed to. The crown didn't just sit on her head, it weighed on every inch of her body, and so she bathed in perfumes, powdered her bones, and emerged each day not as a woman, but as a miracle in silk. Tomorrow, like every day before, she would wake and begin the ritual again, because miracles, even scented ones, require maintenance. Centuries have passed since Elizabeth last powdered her face or dabbed rosewater behind her ears, yet her hygiene, or lack of it, refuses to be buried with her. These days, she lives on not just in textbooks or marble statues, but in TikToks, podcasts, and late-night comedy shows. Her bathing habits have been dissected with a mix of morbid curiosity and awkward laughter, as if the collective modern world cannot quite believe that someone so powerful could also be so pungent. It's a strange kind of fame, not the glory of a warrior or the reverence of a saint, but something closer to a historical meme. She ruled an empire but didn't shower. The punchline goes, it's absurd, and yet undeniably fascinating. Because in an age when most people carry hand sanitizer in their pockets and judge celebrities for skipping deodorant, the idea of a queen skipping water entirely feels both grotesque and thrilling. There's something addictive about the contradiction. How could a woman at the height of power, controlling armies, colonies, and courts, also be someone who avoided bathing as if it were a trap? How could a mind so sharp exist beneath a wig that hadn't been washed in years? The paradox hits like a bad perfume, both shocking and oddly compelling. The Virgin Queen, untouchable and revered, leaving behind trails of civet and sweat, its comedy gold, its podcast fuel, its history that smells just a little too real. But underneath the mockery is something more revealing. This fascination with her hygiene exposes a deep modern obsession, the need to make the powerful seem human, stripping away the crown, layer by scented layer, to get to the body beneath. It's not just about the smell, It's about vulnerability, because if even a monarch couldn't keep herself fresh, maybe it's okay that our gym bags stink too. If she could rule while covered in powder and musk, maybe we could survive a day without dry shampoo. Yet the laughter is never without a hint of unease. We point and giggle, but we're also haunted. There's something claustrophobic about Elizabeth's rituals, something suffocating beneath all that lace and lavender. The modern viewer sees not just a powerful queen, but a woman trapped in a perfume bottle, pressed between the pages of her myth, and maybe, just maybe, we recognise the scent of performance too well, because we still perform, don't we? We still mask our bodies, scrub our floors, and package ourselves for the world. We may have running water and foaming soap, but the pressure to be polished hasn't gone away. We're still terrified of being seen as messy, imperfect, or worst of all, natural. Elizabeth didn't bathe because she feared disease. We bathe because we fear judgment. It's just a different kind of plague. So while we laugh at her perfumed gloves and vinegar rinses, we also envy the clarity of her ritual. She knew exactly what was expected of her. Smells like roses. Looks like marble. Never let them see you sweat. That rulebook, however twisted, was at least consistent. Today, we chase authenticity while still applying filters. We preach self-care while buying products to fix what isn't broken. Maybe Elizabeth's world wasn't so different after all, just with less plumbing. And let's be honest, we love a good scandal, especially when it's safe and historical. Mocking a dead queen's hygiene is easy. She can't clap back, she can't sue, she just sits there in her portrait, powdered and regal, while we analyse her pores from 500 years away. It's voyeurism with a scholarly sheen, gossip dressed up as education. But every time we bring her up on YouTube in lectures or awkward first dates with history majors, we revive something more than just a stereotype. We keep alive the tension between power and humanity, between myth and body, between the crown and the scalp beneath it. And in doing so, we remind ourselves that greatness doesn't always come with good hygiene. It's strangely comforting. Elizabeth ruled without modern dentistry, without shampoo, without soap as we know it. She stood at the centre of one of the world's most powerful empires, while her wig soaked up the sweat of statecraft. And yet she endured, she inspired, she terrified, she smelled like civet and cloves, and still, her name echoes in every corner of history. So maybe the reason we can't stop talking about her isn't just because she stank. Maybe it's because she stank and succeeded. Because she proved that a woman didn't need to be perfect to be powerful. She just needed to be consistent, predictably fragrant, relentlessly composed, immaculately mythic, even if it meant skipping the bath. Of course, the memes will keep coming, the reenactments, the jokes about lead makeup and close stools. But somewhere between the laughs, a strange kind of respect lingers. Not for her hygiene, but for her discipline, for her commitment to the illusion, for the way she turned rosewater into armour and silence into sovereignty. And perhaps, centuries from now, someone will look back on our own rituals, our endless skincare routines, our filtered selfies, our scented candles, and laugh too. They'll marvel at what we did to seem clean, to seem flawless, to seem in control. They'll wonder how we endured the pressure. They'll wonder if we ever truly rested beneath the performance. But for now, Elizabeth remains one of history's most fragrant contradictions, revered and ridiculed, admired and sniffed at, a queen who made cleanliness a legend, even if the truth was a little mustier. By the end of it all, what lingered wasn't just Elizabeth's legend, it was her scent. Her world was thick with it. Every hallway, every gown, every gesture carried a residue of musk and herbs and rosewater that masked more than just the body. It masked a way of life, a world without clean water, without drains, without understanding of bacteria or hygiene. In that world, stench was not a failure of character. It was the background noise of existence. And the Queen knew how to play it like an instrument. There were no showers, no bleach, and no hand soap waiting on marble sinks. Instead, there were basins of vinegar. There were gloves laced with crushed petals. There were wigs stuffed with lavender sachets and cloaks aired near windows until the morning dew pretended to have done the cleaning. But cleaning, in the way we understand it, never truly happened. The idea of stripping filth down to the skin with water and suds was almost laughable. Water was dangerous. It was feared. Especially warm water, which was thought to open the pores and invite disease. So they didn't wash. Not really. They masked. They maintained cleanliness, and Elizabeth, she was the star of that performance. She layered fragrance the way modern royalty layers PR statements. A hint of cloves on the gloves, a touch of rose behind the ears, something sharper, more musky beneath the layers of fabric that never met a washboard. It wasn't subtle, but subtlety wasn't the point. Survival was, to her court, her scent was part of her identity. It trailed behind her like a royal procession. People spoke of it with admiration, though none would admit they were grateful it masked the truth. The truth being that under the velvet and pearls and powdered cheeks, the Queen was a person, a human being, sweating and aching like the rest of them, and sometimes smelling like it. But she understood the assignment. Queens weren't supposed to be human. They were supposed to be ideas. And ideas, conveniently, don't sweat. Of course, Elizabeth didn't invent this system. She inherited it. What she did was perfect it. She took the olfactory expectations of her time and elevated them to an art form. Every scented glove, every perfumed kerchief, every herb-stuffed bodice became part of her daily armour, and the stench of the palace, that sour cocktail of trampled rushes, candle grease, and bodily odours, that was the enemy she battled without lifting a sword. She couldn't control the sewage systems, or lack thereof. She couldn't reroute the river of waste that occasionally meandered too close to royal quarters, but she could control how her body was perceived. She could build a wall of scent so thick it felt impenetrable. Not from illness, of course. That came anyway. But from scrutiny. From the fear that if anyone got too close, they'd see her as just a woman, not a queen, and certainly not a virgin one. The absurd part, it worked. For decades. Ministers, ambassadors, poets, lovers. Everyone walked away believing the fantasy, or at least respecting it enough to keep their mouths shut. They marvelled at her image, her youthfulness, her energy, even as her teeth darkened and her bones ached. The odour of decay was real, but so was the commitment to illusion. She painted over pain, she pondered over mortality, and history, somehow, thanked her for it. If it all sounds theatrical, that's because it was. The palace was a stage, Elizabeth was the lead, and every day was an act of erasure, not of personality, but of vulnerability. She hid the blemishes, the fatigue, the rot beneath layers of powder and perfume, and everyone played along, not because they were fooled, but because they needed the fantasy as much as she did. A fragile court propped up by the idea that the Queen could never smell bad, could never fall ill, could never die. Today, we look back with a mixture of horror and fascination. We dissect her cosmetics, analyse her dental woes, and shake our heads at the lack of plumbing. But there's a part of us that also envies her. Not the filth, certainly, not the pain, but the power of illusion. The ability to curate an identity so potent it could outlive the person. She built herself not just into a monarch, but into a symbol, one that could outlast the stench of the age she lived in, because that age was, by modern standards, absolutely filthy. Streets were cesspools. Food went off quickly. Rats were as common as chairs. The air was heavy with soot, and the rivers were more sewage than stream. Everyone stank. Everyone knew. No one could do much about it, and so they did what humans do best. They adjusted. They layered meaning onto their smells. A woman who smelled of rosemary was refined. A man who stank of leather and sweat was rugged. a monarch who smelled like incense and citrus divine. That, perhaps, is the key to understanding Elizabeth's legacy. She didn't deny the stink, she transcended it. She turned it into a metaphor, and in doing so, she left behind not just a throne, but a blueprint for how to rule in an unclean world, not by washing, but by enchanting, not by scrubbing, but by distracting. Even her death didn't entirely dispel the perfume. The legend held, and centuries later, we still picture her powdered and pristine, framed by candlelight, untouched by grime. Never mind the real body beneath. That part was edited out, on purpose, because the truth would have smelled a little too real. So when we remember her now, let's not sanitize the past. Let's remember the perfumes and the plague, the incense and the infection. Let's remember that power has always depended on presentation, and sometimes all it takes to rule the room is smelling slightly better than everyone else. Now rest. Let the scent of history settle. You've walked through powdered halls and fragrant deception long enough for one night. It's time to close your eyes and drift far, far from the court of rose-scented musks. The Queen sleeps now, and so should you. Good night, traveller. May your dreams be clean, even if history was not.